I'll be reading from Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened cattle have been butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how did you get in here without wedding clothes?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'"
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate that reading. It's been a good day. I've enjoyed so much the worship today, but it's certainly good to have you here tonight. Since there's so few of us, I may make this sermon rather brief, but I do believe that it's worth our consideration. The parable under consideration tonight, I'm surprised that the commentaries pretty well agree that this may have been the last major parable that Jesus taught before his crucifixion. Secondly, I'm surprised how often Jesus talks about the condition of the Jews. I believe this parable is directed primarily to the Jewish people. And Jesus is telling them why the city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. The city of Jerusalem evidently was destroyed because of the rejection of the Jews for Jesus, especially the leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so Jesus is telling this parable. He talks about a king. By the way, if you would go to Luke chapter 14, verses 16 through 24, you're going to find a very similar parable, but most of the commentaries have agreed that they're not the same parable. Jesus went everywhere preaching. And as he would preach in different cities, he would often tell the same type of parables, but he would change it so that the people would listen to him. But this parable deals primarily with the rejection of the Jewish people in Jesus. Talks about this king that made a wedding feast for his son. Back in the days of Christ, a young couple would agree to marry, but the date was not set. And often there would be a wedding banquet. And what would happen is that the parents, this time the king, sent out all kinds of invitations, invited a host of people. And what would happen is that when the couple would decide to get married, then they would call those who are invited to the wedding feast. And evidently that's what happened here. And Jesus is saying that the king sent out his servants to encourage those who were invited to come to the feast. But they refused. Had all kinds of excuses. And Jesus does not tell us how he viewed those excuses. Just told us what they were. But these people used those excuses to tell the king, I can't come. And so the king sent out more servants. And it's interesting that Jesus says that those that were invited, evidently they were friends, acquaintance of the king. I don't think he would have invited people that were not his friends, or at least his acquaintance. But they began to abuse the servants. And the servants were just inviting them to the banquet, even to the point that they killed some. There's no doubt in my mind that Jesus had the prophets in mind. And the prophets would invite the people, the Jewish people, to come to Jesus. It was a free offering. It was a great banquet and something that people would value, but they refused to come. And how well we know from reading the Gospels, that's exactly what happened with the Jewish people. For some reason, the Jewish people were impressed with what Jesus taught and what he did. But they would not come to him for various reasons. And so Jesus kept inviting up until the very day that he was hung on the cross. He was inviting people to come, to believe in him, to follow him, to become his disciples. And they continued to refuse. And I was impressed with the fact that the commentators almost universally accredited the destruction of Jerusalem to that refusal. The only way that the Jewish people could be convinced that the old law was done away was a destruction of the city and the temple. And it's interesting as you study Jewish history. Circumcision and sacrifices, Sabbath worship, was a real problem during the life of Christ and the life of the apostles. When Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, that pretty well ended that conflict that existed with the Jews and circumcision and sacrifices and Sabbath worship. That's interesting. They, I think, finally realized that their rejection of Jesus brought destruction. And so this king is saying to his servants, after they came back and gave a record of all of the excuses that were made, the king became furious. He sent his armies out and destroyed those who were invited. and burned their cities. While I know that this is a message to the Jewish people, I think there's an implication for us today. I find often that there is a dual fulfillment of many of the lessons of Jesus. And I think this is one of them. He directed his attention to the Jewish people who rejected him. But I think there's an implication there for us today. Have you witnessed the excuses that people make when they're invited to become a Christian, a child of God? If you've made any effort in evangelism, you know that happens. Back in the 60s and 70s, I was part of a campaign, West Virginia. And every summer we would get together. I can remember that we went to Clarksburg one summer, went to Huntington another summer, and went to many of the other cities. I think it was 13 cities that we visited in those campaigns in the summertime. We would spend anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks knocking doors, inviting people to study. And it was amazing that people would agree to study. And I thought, were very effective in our campaign. But as you study with people, they are very quick to offer excuses and not become a Christian. And we find that today. I challenge you to go next door. Go down the street. Knock on the doors of the people that live on your street. And tell me how many of them will welcome your call, will open the door and be anxious to study with you and become a Christian. People have all kinds of reasons why they don't obey the gospel, why they don't listen. Even among us, there are some who are offering excuses. So Jesus is teaching us his disapproval, his anger. Yeah, I think Jesus becomes angry at all of the excuses that are offered by people who are invited into God's kingdom. It is not something that's popular in the world today. Barb and I went out for a sandwich this afternoon after worship here. Met a family for the first time. Began talking with them about where they went to worship. And I invited them to come here to worship. They knew where we live, where the building is. They were well aware of the church. But it was very, very clear that they stopped the conversation quickly. They were not interested. I find that all the time. And I think this parable is telling us that Jesus gets angry when that happens. I don't know if this parable points to the judgment scene or not. Some have suggested that's it. Some have suggested that Jesus is teaching that his anger will be displayed in the judgment. And those who are invited to become Christians and find excuses for not becoming Christians will be destroyed. Well, they'll be punished. They'll be rejected by the Lord. And they certainly will not be invited into the heavenly. I think that is a lesson that we have learned over the years. We've seen it, we've experienced it, and we know it happens. But it's interesting as I read on in verse 11 on through verse 13 that Jesus, or the king really, the king when he visited the wedding feast, interesting, he was not there to welcome to the feast. He came in later. And he saw there a man that did not have on a wedding garment. One of the commentaries suggested that it was the role of the king to provide those wedding clothes. But this man did not have the proper clothes that would allow him to be part of that wedding feast. So he was rejected. The king called his servants, told them to bind him, take him out, cast him into outer darkness. That certainly, in my mind, points to the judgment scene. But it also points to me that when we accept the invitation to the wedding feast, by the way, Revelation chapter 19 talks about those invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb. Okay, so maybe this wedding feast is pointing to, again, the final judgment. I'm not sure. But this man was expected to have on the proper clothing. When people are invited into the kingdom of Christ, they're expected to be clothed properly. And I don't think it's talking about physical clothing. I think he's talking about here as a person that realizes the responsibility that he has when he comes to the wedding feast. Not only to have on wedding clothes, but in the kingdom he's expected to live a righteous life. And when we come into the church and we don't conduct ourselves righteously, and we're not responsible Christians in the sight of God, we too can be judged improperly. And if that statement, bind him and carry him out and cast him into outer darkness, if that refers to the judgment, certainly it ought to make us aware of the fact that just becoming a Christian is not enough. God expects us to live the Christian life. God expects us to be faithful. Did he not say, be faithful unto death and you receive a crown of life? Revelation 2:10. Did he not impress upon our minds that we, if we want to become his disciples, we need to learn to deny ourselves, take up our cross every day and follow him? We have responsibilities. Evidently, this man did not realize, maybe it wasn't taught, maybe it wasn't explained to him, but for some reason he did not realize his responsibility as one invited to that wedding feast, and he was condemned. So what I see in this parable, very briefly, is that our role is to invite people into the church. Do our very, very best as God's servants to carry the message. Constantly be inviting people. I don't know what result will happen from the invitation that I gave today. I don't know. But I felt I needed to do that. I know that my brother Don called me this week and said that the family that bought Phyllis Gouting's house moved in. And Don had a conversation with the man. The man was very unhappy with the church where he was attending, and Don invited him to come here. And he indicated that he would. I was hoping I would see him today, but they did not come. I don't know if they will or not, but they've been invited. That's our role, is to invite people as we can. Their responsibility is to accept it. And if they do not accept the invitation, again I suggest, the Lord becomes angry. We need to be doing what we can do. We need to make sure that we use every opportunity that God provides for us to invite people to the wedding feast. We're not responsible for how they respond. That's their decision to make. But we need to be inviting people. It doesn't take much. It didn't take much for me today to invite the family to worship with us. And again, I don't know what the results may be. But we invite people. And then it's their responsibility to respond properly. But once they become a Christian, then it's our responsibility to teach them how to conduct themselves as a Christian. And again, if they refuse, that's their decision. We've done what we can do. So this parable is interesting. Jesus invited many of the Jews to follow him. Only a few followed him. Many were invited, but few were chosen. Few accepted the invitation. Few came to the wedding feast. And even a fewer group of people were faithful and wore the proper spiritual clothes that they would be accepted at the wedding feast. We're not responsible for the world. We are responsible for ourselves. And I appreciate so much you being here tonight, demonstrating your faithfulness, demonstrating your love for the Lord. And you are very, very encouraging to those of us who are trying to follow the Lord. God bless you. And right now, Greg, if you're subject to the gospel call, come as together we stand and sing.
Without him I could do nothing. Without him